All right, so let's continue with our discussion of libertarianism and healthcare. In the last video, we saw that a decent minimum of healthcare, although not a right that libertarians recognize, is still compatible with libertarian theory. And so because they have duties of beneficence, and one practical way of securing efficiency for their charity is a system of taxation for healthcare, their position is at least compatible with a decent minimum of healthcare. It's morally justified, in other words. It wouldn't violate any moral principles because it's not violating their right. It's something they have a moral obligation to contribute to outside of rights to property. However, I think there's a more fundamental response that the libertarian can give, and this deals with different types of libertarianism. So here's what I would say in response to this idea of libertarianism in healthcare. Right. So in our political climate right now, the libertarian position is not represented very fairly. Basically, the problem with our political climate is it only shows us one version of libertarianism. We're going to call that right libertarianism. But this isn't the only version, right? This is sort of one major branch of libertarian thinking. There's a second major branch of libertarian thinking that doesn't get much play in our political climate, but is a very popular political theory or theory of justice. So let's see how these things are different, right? So the main difference between the two, they still both believe in strong rights to individual liberty, and they do believe in property rights. But the major difference between the two is that they differ in how people can come to own natural resources. So part of this thinking requires you to imagine a period of time before there was a society, right, before a government, when there were just people born into this world that was sort of unclaimed by anybody else, right? So imagine going back, you're the first set of people who ever stepped foot into the United States, and there's all this unclaimed territory, unclaimed resources on the territory. How do we divide it up? Right? Who gets to own it and how? So right libertarians say it's just those who were the first to mix their labor with those resources that gets to own them. Right? So the right libertarian says you have a right to your body, and you have a right to the powers of your body, in other words, your labor. And anytime you mix that labor with an unclaimed natural resource, it becomes yours. Right? So even though others are in this land, really it just depends on who claims it first, who mixes their labor with it first. And an important point about this right libertarian position is that you can take as much as you want, or as much as you can use from this natural stock, and you don't have to worry how other people interpret it, right? You don't have to compensate them for taking more. You don't have to get their consent in order to take a bit of property. So if there's an apple tree and there's 20 apples on it and there's 20 people there, if you run up and mix your labor with 10 of the apples, then they're yours. Even though you're taking more than what would be your fair share, it doesn't matter. It's what you mixed your labor with gives you a property right to those 10 apples. So abstract away a little bit, move forward in time, right? People will be able to take far more of the natural resources than others. And so majority of resources could get stockpiled within a very small set of hands, while the majority of people missed out. They didn't get a chance to mix their labor with it as quickly. And so they now have fewer resources. But there's nothing wrong with that according to the right libertarian. That's just how you come to own property, is you mix your labor with it. The left libertarian gives a very different answer to this question. They say, no, look, the natural resources belong to everybody, right? So when the group of 20 came to the United States and they're looking around and they see this apple tree, it's not whoever can run to it first and pick as many apples gets to take however many to get, right? There's 20 apples on the tree. There's 20 of you. These natural resources belong to all of you. So you have to divide up those 20 apples. Now, the immediate fair way would just be to give each of the 20 one apple, right? Everybody gets one. It's a fair division of the natural resources available. But the left libertarian doesn't say we have to divide everything up exactly equally. They say, no, look, you can claim more than your fair share. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to claim more than the fair share for yourself, if you're going to take more than you need, then you must compensate the other people for the lack of resources they now have. Right, so it could be that you get more apples, but you give them more oranges, and somehow it's compensated. Or you take all of the apple trees, right, and so now you own the apple trees, but you give them a cut of all of that. So you do the labor, right? You grow and maintain the apple trees, but they get a cut of what you produce, in order to make up for the fact that you haven't given them any apple trees, right? You took all of the apple trees, so now you need a way to compensate them for their loss, their inability to have apple trees of their own. Okay, so this is roughly the difference between the two, right? It's how you come to own natural resources. Right libertarians, you just mix your labor. Left libertarians, everybody owns them already, right? The world is sort of for everybody to share. And so if you're going to take more, then you have to compensate them in some way. It doesn't have to be, I took one apple, I took 2 apples, I need to give you one other thing to make even, right? It's just you need to compensate them in some way for taking more than your fair share of the resources. And so hopefully you see how this changes the response to healthcare, right? If we aren't a right libertarian and we're a left libertarian, well, then a minimal, decent amount of healthcare is compatible. Right, so all libertarian views are going to require an historical analysis of how the resources were claimed. Right, we have to go back in time and see who took what and see how they were transferred from one person to the next, blah, 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 blah. But clearly in our world right now, we know that some people have appropriated more than their fair share of the natural resources. And so what's happened is some people have been left at a disadvantage, right? They don't have as much, let's say, property, right? There was a group of people who now owns most of the land in the United States. So a number of people cannot own any land. And so they are at a disadvantage and they suffer for it. And so they don't have the same resources as everybody else and they can't afford health care. And so using the ownership principles of left libertarianism, some people took more. Others are suffering now. So we have to compensate those who are suffering in some way. So we could do that. We could just do some set of wealth redistribution through taxation in order to provide health care to the needy. This is morally permissible, and this does not violate our property rights according to the left libertarian, because we don't have a right to more than our fair share. So if we took more than our fair share and now we own more land, we can compensate these people by providing the needy with health care. So it's a way of bringing us back into equilibrium, making sure that everybody sort of gets their fair share, even though resources aren't literally divided up evenly, right? If I get more property, I can help pay for your tax care, your medical care through taxes, etc. So the important point is healthcare does, a right to healthcare does violate our property rights according to the right libertarian, does not according to the left libertarian. So now you have an important question. Which theory is more plausible? Left or right libertarianism? And so the debate really, I think, centers around 2 main ideas, right? One is the thing we've already been talking about. Who owns unclaimed resources, right? Are natural resources something that are shared or not? So that's something you have to answer for yourself. If you were to sort of come into the world with a bunch of other people and there was this unclaimed land, would you think, hey, this is for all of us to share? Or do you want to say, no, I'm getting as much as I can for me? Right? One way to think about this is God normally says, if you're religious, right, there's a normal principle that God says this land is for all of us, it's for all of his children to share equally, blah, blah, blah. So whatever it is that the God principle says, right, in some way, this land is supposed to be shared by everybody. So it's just going to depend on how you view that, right? Do you think the natural resources are unclaimed and shared, or do you think that you have to go out and take as much as you can? But there's also, I think, a more important question that we can ask that differentiates the 2 views. And that's, look, libertarians are all about protecting freedom and liberty. So which account actually results in greater liberty for the individual? In other words, they're both saying they have the correct account of autonomy. Right? So let's see which one seems more plausible to you. Right libertarians are going to say, look, people are free when they can exercise their liberties free from the interference of others. Right? So right libertarians look a lot like negative rights theorists, right? Which you're familiar with already. So the right libertarian is going to say, look, I'm free when I'm not forced to give my resources to any cause that I do not deem worthy. Right? So taxation is theft, because anytime you take taxes from me without my consent, you are violating my property rights. So I'm more free if you don't violate my property rights. And so that might suck for me sometimes because I might not end up with a lot of property, but at least I'm free to do whatever I want with what I have. The left libertarian is going to say, no, people are free when they have worthwhile choices to act upon, even if that means there's some interference with my property. So left libertarians still think that property rights are important, but they allow for a little bit more interference with their property rights in order to get us all a better set of choices. So one way to think about this is with basic education. Right, so left libertarians can say, okay, a tax to provide a basic level of education is justified. It's a justified interference with our property right, because if everybody is educated, they're going to have more options. So here's one way of thinking about this, right? If you live in a closed society where you're never taught about any other way of life, and then you choose the closed society's culture, did you really make that choice freely, or was it just sort of, okay, well, you don't realize there are other choices out there? The left libertarians say, let's educate all of these people, show them the different ways that life can go, the different ways life can have meaning, and then give them the intellectual capability to rationally choose between these different ways of life. Right? The right libertarian can only do that with privately funded education. The left libertarian can say, no, tax us. That's a justified interference with our property. And now people will be more autonomous because of it, because everybody will have at least the basic tools they need to make a rational decision about the best course for their life. So besides those two very general principles, maybe you're feeling one way or the other, here are at least two cases for you to think about. Case one is education. So is a person more free when they receive no formal education, but they're not forced to contribute to the education of others, right? So I'm too poor to get a private education, but at least I'm not taxed and have to contribute to others' education. That's when the right libertarian says you're more free. The left libertarian says, well, asks, is a person more free when they're forced to contribute to the education of others, but are guaranteed a minimum of education to decide which life is best? Right, so look, I'm not completely free because I have to give some taxes to education, but I'm more free overall because now I have the mental power to choose which life is best. Case two deals with healthcare, right? The right libertarian versus left libertarian. Is a person more free when they don't have to contribute to a public healthcare system, but may be unable to afford life-saving care for themselves? That's when the right libertarian says you're more free. Right? You're not taxed. No one's violating your property rights and making you contribute to other people's health care, but you could end up in a situation where you don't have the money to afford life-saving care, and then you die. Right? So is that person more free, or is the second person more free, where they're guaranteed life-saving care regardless of their ability to pay, but they have to contribute a little bit in taxes to a public health care system? So, I mean, these are open cases for you, right? I'm giving you the presentation of both views, and then you have to decide which person sounds more free to you. Is it the person who doesn't have to give anything in taxes and maintains full use of their property, but might not get an education and might not be able to survive a life-threatening illness? Or is it the person who gets the basic education and might survive and will get the treatment needed to survive a life-threatening illness, but also has to contribute in taxes? I personally find the left libertarian's account more satisfying. That's true autonomy, is when you have reasonable and worthwhile choices in front of you, not just when people aren't interfering with you. So what's our conclusion about libertarianism and healthcare? Well, right libertarians are consistent with a decent minimum, but it has nothing to do with a right. Taxation would violate their rights to property, but they might have reasons of beneficence to contribute to public health care. Whereas left libertarians, there's not a big problem. Right to a decent minimum is consistent because it doesn't violate your property rights. And that's it for libertarianism.